Eleanor Vance had learned, long ago, the particular art of making herself small. She had learned it at dinner tables, where her mother's eyes moved past her and settled, warm and admiring, on her elder sister's face. She had learned it in ballrooms where gentlemen bowed to Louisa first, always first, and only remembered to bow to Eleanor when their manners obliged them to. She had learned it in mirrors, where she had long ago stopped looking for anything worth seeing. And on the morning that the household at Bramwell Hall erupted into its now familiar frenzy of ribbons and lace and breathless congratulation, Eleanor stood at the edge of the drawing room in her plain grey gown and understood, without needing to be told, that she was meant to disappear. "The Earl of Rosemere," her mother said, for perhaps the 10th time that morning, pressing a hand to her own chest, as though the words themselves might overwhelm her. "Louisa, my dearest girl, do you understand what this means? An earl, a real, living earl, come to settle himself not 3 miles from this house, and already asking after you by name." Louisa Vance, golden-haired and lovely in the particular way that made rooms go quiet when she entered them, smiled the smile she had been taught since infancy, the one that showed just enough teeth to seem warm and not enough to seem eager. "I have not even met him, Mamma." "You will, tomorrow, at the Ashworth reception, and mark me, Louisa, by the time the candles are lit, you will have secured more than an introduction." Mrs. Vance turned, and her gaze slid over Eleanor the way it slid over the furniture, noting her presence without truly seeing her. "Eleanor, you will attend as chaperone, of course, and you will wear something suitable, something that does not draw attention." It was not cruelty precisely. Eleanor had long since stopped calling it that, if only because cruelty implied intention, and her mother rarely intended anything beyond survival. The family's fortunes had thinned year over year since her father's failed investments, since the roof had needed mending and the tenant farms had yielded less than promised, since the quiet, creeping knowledge that Bramwell Hall might not remain theirs much longer had settled over the household like a fog that never fully lifted. Louisa's beauty was the family's last remaining asset, and Eleanor had grown up understanding, without bitterness, that she herself was not. She had grown up understanding something else, too, though she rarely allowed herself to think of it. 7 years ago, in a summer that felt now like a dream half-remembered, she had loved a man who did not exist. She had called him Gabriel then, though she had never learned if that was the whole of his name or only the part he had chosen to give her. He had come to the village of Hartwick that summer, thin and quiet, staying at the old rectory to recover from a fever that had nearly killed him, a second son of some family or another, with no expectations and no fortune, or so he had told her, sitting on the broken wall of the ruined chapel above the mill pond, with his coat sleeves rolled and his eyes fixed on her as though she were the only interesting thing in the county. She remembered the particulars of it still, with an exactness that frightened her if she allowed herself to look at them too closely. She remembered the first afternoon she had found him there, pale and thin in the shade of the chapel wall, with a book of poetry open, unread, upon his knee, and how he had looked up at her with the startled, unguarded expression of a man who had forgotten, for a moment, that the world contained other people. He had asked, without any of the practiced ease of the young men who called upon Louisa, whether she thought Cowper a genuine poet of feeling or merely a fashionable melancholic, and the question had so surprised her, coming from a stranger with nothing better to do than recover from his fever in the sun, that she had answered honestly, at length, and with more heat than she had intended. He had argued back. That was the thing she remembered most clearly of all, the thing that had undone her so completely that summer. He had not simply agreed with her to be agreeable, as gentlemen so often did with young women they wished to charm. He had disagreed and pressed her further, and changed his opinion only when she had genuinely persuaded him, and she had walked home that first evening with her whole chest full of something she did not yet have a name for, only the dizzy, unfamiliar sense of having been truly heard. They had met at the chapel a dozen times that summer, always by accident that neither of them entirely believed was accidental, and always with the same careful, hungry attention to each other's words that made the hours vanish without either of them noticing. He had told her he was a second son with no expectations, and she had believed him without question, because it had never once occurred to her that a man might invent poverty rather than fortune, and because it had suited them both, in that stolen season, to be simply Gabriel and simply Eleanor, unburdened by any name that came before or after. He had asked her, on a warm evening near the end of August, whether she thought a woman could love a man with nothing to offer her but his company and his correspondence, and she had told him, with the fierce, unthinking certainty of 17, that she thought it the only kind of love worth having. He had gone very quiet at that, and had taken her hand, briefly, and pressed it once, and told her he would remember she had said so for the whole of his life, however long or short that life proved to be. He had told her, that same evening, that he would write, that he would return, that whatever separated them now was temporary, and whatever bound them was not. 3 days later, a rider had come for him in the night, and by morning he was gone from the rectory entirely, with only a hastily scrawled note left for the rector explaining that urgent family business called him away and thanking the household for its kindness. He had left nothing for Eleanor at all, not that first morning, and she had stood at the chapel gate for the better part of an hour, certain some message must be coming, until the certainty had curdled slowly into doubt, and the doubt into the long, grinding grief of a girl who did not yet understand that the world could take something from her without so much as the courtesy of an explanation. He had not written, he had not returned, and Eleanor Vance, 17 and foolish and entirely unprepared for the particular grief of being forgotten by someone who had once made her feel seen, had folded the memory away into some drawer of herself and had not opened it again in 7 years. Until now, apparently, when the drawing-room was full of talk of an earl. It cannot be him, she told herself that night, lying awake and staring at the water-stained ceiling of her narrow bedchamber. Gabriel had no title. Gabriel had nothing. And yet something in her chest had gone very still and very cold the moment her mother had said the name Rosemere, as though some old wound, long since scarred over, had remembered how to ache. She told herself it was foolishness. She told herself that England was full of earls, and that the poor young man who had once quoted Cowper to her over the sound of the mill wheel was surely married by now, or dead, or simply gone the way that people go when they have no reason to stay. She told herself this so firmly and so often that by the morning of the reception she nearly believed it. The reception itself confirmed nothing, for the new Earl of Rosemere did not attend. Word came instead by his steward, apologetic and brief. His lordship had been detained by matters of estate business and sent his regrets, along with an invitation for the family to call upon Rosemere Park at their earliest convenience. Mrs. Vance was nearly incandescent with disappointed hope. Louisa, for her part, seemed almost relieved. "You do not wish to marry him?" Eleanor asked her sister that night, brushing out Louisa's long golden hair by candlelight, a small ritual of tenderness that had survived between them despite everything their mother had built to separate them. Louisa was quiet for a long moment. "I wish to marry someone," she said finally, carefully, "who does not require me to have secured him before we have even spoken. Mamma speaks of him as though he were a fortune to be captured, not a man to be known." She met Eleanor's eyes in the looking-glass. "Do you never wish for that, Nell? To be known, rather than captured?" Eleanor's hands stilled on her sister's hair. "Once," she said quietly, "a long time ago." Louisa turned in her seat, her lovely face suddenly serious. "You have never told me about him, the one you loved, before." "There is nothing to tell. He left. That is the whole of the story." "That is never the whole of any story," Louisa said, and there was something so gentle in it, so entirely without the vanity their mother had cultivated in her, that Eleanor felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. Perhaps, she thought, she had misjudged her sister all these years, mistaking the shape their mother had pressed her into for the whole of who she was. It was 3 days later that Eleanor found herself walking alone toward the ruined chapel above the mill pond, a habit she had never fully broken despite the ache it cost her. Carrying with her a small posy of late summer flowers, she meant to leave, as she sometimes did, on the crumbling stone where she had once sat beside a man who was not what he seemed. The sky had gone the color of a bruise, heavy with a rain that had not yet decided to fall, and the path was empty, and she was glad of it, glad to have this one small grief entirely to herself. She did not know that the new Earl of Rosemere had ridden out from his estate that same morning, alone and without his steward's knowledge, drawn by a restlessness he could not quite name, toward the one place in the county he had sworn to himself he would not visit, and had visited anyway, 3 times now, in the fortnight since his arrival. She did not know that he had spent 7 years believing she had married another man because he had been told so in a letter he had never questioned enough to doubt. She did not know, as she pushed open the low iron gate and stepped into the chapel's roofless nave, that the man standing at the far end of it, his back to her, dressed in the plain dark coat of a gentleman who had ridden without ceremony, was the same man whose name she had spent 7 years trying not to say. He turned at the sound of the gate. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wind came up through the broken windows and stirred the ivy along the walls, and somewhere below them the mill pond turned its slow, indifferent circle, and Eleanor Vance stood very still, the posy of flowers forgotten in her hand, staring at a face she had told herself for 7 years she had surely misremembered. She had not misremembered it. If anything, memory had softened him. The man before her was leaner than the boy had been, and there was a stillness to him now that spoke of years she knew nothing of, a gravity in the set of his shoulders that had not been there when he had sat on the broken wall and laughed at something she had said about a novel neither of their mothers would have approved of. But the eyes were the same. The eyes had never changed at all. "Gabriel," she said, before she could stop herself, and then, hearing her own voice crack on the name, she pressed her lips together and looked away, furious at herself for the tremor in it. "You remember me?" His voice was rougher than she recalled, and something in it made her look back at him despite herself. He had gone very pale. "I did not let myself hope that you would still." He stopped, started again. "Eleanor, I did not know you were here. I did not know you still lived in Hartwick. I have been coming to this place for a fortnight, like a man walking a wound, and I never once let myself believe I would find you in it." "You knew my name," she said, and it came out sharper than she intended, 7 years of carefully buried hurt rising in her all at once. "You knew where to find me, if you had wished to. You knew it the summer you left. I wrote to you." He took a step toward her, then stopped himself, as though remembering some rule of distance he had set for himself. "Eleanor, I wrote to you every week, for the better part of a year. I have never stopped wondering why you never once replied." The words struck her like cold water. "You did not write, not once. I waited." Her voice broke entirely now, and she hated herself for it. Hated that 7 years of composure could be undone by the sight of a face she had thought she would never see again. "I waited for a letter that never came, and then I stopped waiting, because a girl cannot spend her whole life waiting for a man who does not think her worth a single line. I do not understand." He looked, for the first time, genuinely bewildered, and beneath the bewilderment, something that might have been the beginning of fury, though not directed at her. "I was told," he stopped himself again, and this time she saw something click into place behind his eyes, some understanding arriving too late to be of any comfort. "I was told you had married, within the year of my leaving. I was told it by a source I had no reason to doubt, and I believed it, God forgive me, because it was easier to believe you happy than to believe you had simply stopped caring." Eleanor's breath left her in a single, unsteady exhale. "Who told you that?" "I do not know that it matters now." "It matters a great deal to me," she said, and there was iron in it now beneath the hurt. the particular steel of a woman who had spent 7 years believing herself forgotten and had just been told, in the space of a few sentences, that the entire foundation of that belief might have been a lie. "Someone lied to you, my lord, and someone kept your letters from me. If you say you sent them, and I should very much like to know which of us was deceived more thoroughly." "Both of us, I think," he said quietly. "Both of us, equally, and by someone who understood exactly how to wound us in the places we could least protect." They stood there a moment longer, the wind moving between them, 7 years of separate griefs suddenly collapsing into a single shared confusion, and Eleanor found that she could not, in that moment, decide whether to weep or to rage, and so she did neither, and simply looked at him, at the man who had once been a poor stranger, with nothing to offer her but conversation and kindness, and was now, impossibly, the Earl of Rosemere, the very man her mother had spent a fortnight scheming to place before her sister. "You are betrothed," she said finally, because it was the only fact that mattered now, the only wall left standing between them. "Or as good as. My mother believes it settled in all but name. You are to marry my sister." Something crossed his face then that she could not read. "I have met your sister precisely once, at a distance, across a church aisle, and exchanged perhaps 4 words with her in my life. Whatever your mother believes settled has been settled entirely without my consent, and I confess I did not know until this instant that the young lady in question was your sister." "Louisa," Eleanor said. "Louisa Vance. My mother has arranged the whole of it in her head, if nowhere else, and my father's debts make the arrangement a matter of some urgency, whatever your feelings on it may be." He was silent for a long moment, and she watched something shift behind his eyes, some rapid and unhappy recalculation. "I see," he said finally. "Then I have arrived at a rather worse moment than I imagined." "You have arrived," Eleanor said, gathering what remained of her composure around her like a cloak, "at exactly the moment you were always going to arrive at, my lord, 7 years too late, and entangled, however unwillingly, with the wrong sister. I wish you good day." And because she did not trust herself to remain a moment longer without disgracing herself entirely, she turned and left him standing among the broken stones, the posy of flowers still crushed forgotten in her fist, and did not look back once on the long walk home, though every step of it felt like tearing something loose from her chest. She told no one what had happened. She could not have found the words even if she had wished to, and she did not wish to, not yet, not until she understood the shape of it herself. She spent that night and the next in a state of quiet, private turmoil, turning the encounter over and over, as though it were a stone she might eventually wear smooth, and finding instead that it only cut her more deeply each time. Word came, 3 days later, that the Earl of Rosemere had formally called upon the family and would be dining at Bramwell Hall the following evening. "He asked for you specifically," her mother told Louisa, practically glowing with vindicated ambition, "by name, if you can credit it, and inquired most particularly after the health of the household. Eleanor, you will attend, and you will be pleasant, and you will not, I beg you, embarrass this family with any of your usual quiet sulking." Eleanor said nothing. She was too busy trying to understand why a man who had asked after the health of the household, rather than the beauty of her sister, might have done so. She understood the following evening, when the Earl of Rosemere arrived at Bramwell Hall dressed in the careful, correct elegance of his rank, and bowed to her mother, and bowed to Louisa, and then turned to Eleanor and held her gaze a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed, and said, in a voice pitched for the whole room to hear but meant, she understood immediately, only for her, "Miss Eleanor Vance. We have met before, I believe, though it has been some years." Her mother's head turned so sharply that Eleanor nearly laughed despite herself. "You have met? Eleanor, you never said." "It was a very brief acquaintance, Mamma, some years ago, when his lordship was staying at the old rectory." Eleanor kept her voice as even as she could manage, though her heart was beating so hard she feared it might be visible through her bodice. "I did not think it worth mentioning." "Not worth mentioning. the Earl repeated, with a faint and private irony that only she could have caught. "Though I confess, I have thought of little else since my arrival in the county." He turned back to Mrs. Vance before that particular silence could stretch too long, and offered some correct and unremarkable pleasantry about the weather, and the moment passed, though Eleanor felt it lodge somewhere beneath her ribs like a splinter she could not remove. Dinner was, for Eleanor, an exercise in careful suffering. She watched her mother direct every conversational current toward Louisa's accomplishments, her music, her needlework, her celebrated grace at the last assembly, and she watched the Earl of Rosemere receive each offering with polite, correct attention and precisely nothing more, his eyes returning again and again, whenever he believed himself unobserved, to the far end of the table where Eleanor sat in the grey gown her mother had chosen because it would not draw attention. It drew his attention entirely. She could feel it, the weight of his gaze, like sun through a window she had forgotten was there. "Miss Eleanor," he said, near the end of the meal, when her mother had paused for breath between one boast and the next, "I understand you are fond of cowper." The question was so precisely, so deliberately chosen, that Eleanor's fork stilled halfway to her plate. It was a small thing, a book they had once argued over on a broken wall above a mill pond, and he had remembered it across 7 years and an entire lifetime of separation, and had chosen, in front of her whole family, to ask her about it, rather than anything else in the world. "I am, my lord," she managed. "Though I confess my opinions on him have not improved with age. I still think him overly fond of his own melancholy." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth, the ghost of a smile she remembered far too well. "I once knew someone who held precisely that opinion. I have never forgotten the argument, nor, I confess, come around fully to her side of it." "Her side?" Mrs. Vance interjected, sensing some current beneath the conversation she could not quite chart. "Whose side, my lord?" "An old acquaintance," he said smoothly, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's, whose good opinion I valued rather more than I understood at the time. Louisa, to her credit, said nothing, though Eleanor caught her sister watching the exchange with an expression of quiet, thoughtful attention that made her uneasy. Louisa was not stupid. Louisa had never been stupid, only carefully arranged, and Eleanor feared what her sister might already be beginning to understand. She feared it more the following week, when Louisa found her alone in the garden, deadheading roses with more violence than the task strictly required. "You loved him," Louisa said, without preamble, settling herself on the stone bench beside the rosebed. "Before, the acquaintance he spoke of at dinner. It was you." Eleanor's hands stilled among the thorns. "Louisa, I am not a fool, Nell, whatever Mama believes. I saw the way he looked at you, and I saw the way you would not look at him at all, which is its own kind of confession." Louisa's voice was gentle, entirely without accusation. "You need not protect me from it. I have told you already, I do not wish to be captured. If his heart is engaged elsewhere, I would far rather know it now than discover it after the vows are spoken." "It does not matter what his heart is or is not engaged in," Eleanor said, more sharply than she intended, the old grief rising in her again, sudden and raw. "He is an earl. I am nothing, Louisa. I have no dowry worth speaking of and no beauty worth commenting on, and whatever passed between us 7 years ago was a boy's fancy that came to nothing, because that is what such fancies do. He will marry you, or someone very like you, because that is the shape the world has cut for men like him, and I will be glad of it, because it will save this family, and I have long since made my peace with being the sister who is glad of things, rather than the one who has them." Louisa was quiet for a moment, then she reached over and took her sister's thorn-scratched hand in both of hers. "I do not think you have made your peace with anything at all," she said softly. "I think you have only grown very good at pretending to." Eleanor did not answer, because she feared, if she opened her mouth again, that she would weep, and she had promised herself years ago that she would not weep over Gabriel Ashworth a second time. The days that followed brought a slow, unbearable proximity. The Earl of Rosemere called upon Bramwell Hall with a frequency that delighted Mrs. Vance and unsettled everyone else, and though propriety required that his attentions be understood as directed toward Louisa, Eleanor found herself, again and again, the object of some small, deliberate kindness that could not have been accidental. He asked after her opinion on the estate's neglected library, and when she gave it, freely and at some length, he returned the following week with 3 volumes he thought she might enjoy, presented to the household generally but pressed, quietly, into her hands alone. He noticed, when no one else did, that she had gone without supper one evening after a headache, and ensured, without comment, that a tray was sent to her room. He remembered small things she had said in passing, and returned to them days later, as though he had turned them over in his mind in the interval, unable to set them down. "He is courting you," Louisa said one evening, with the particular flatness of someone stating an obvious fact. "Under cover of courting me, and I begin to think our mother is the only person in the county who has not noticed." "He is being kind," Eleanor said, though even to her own ears it sounded like a poor defense. "There is a difference." "There is no difference at all, and you know it." Louisa's eyes were bright with something that was not, Eleanor realized with some surprise, jealousy at all, but a kind of eager, hopeful mischief. "Nell, I do not want him. I have never wanted him. If it is you he wants, then I would far rather he had the courage to say so plainly, and spare us all this dreadful pretending." But the Earl did not say so plainly, not yet, and Eleanor understood why, even as it frustrated her. His position was precarious in ways she was only beginning to grasp. To withdraw from an understanding that half the county now believed settled in favor of the elder daughter's plainer, poorer sister would invite exactly the kind of scandal that could damage them both, and would leave the Vance family's finances, already fragile, in worse ruin than before, should her father's creditors grow impatient at the failure of the match everyone expected. He was, she came to understand, waiting for some way to unravel the situation without destroying the people caught within it, and in the waiting, the tension between them grew nearly unbearable. Mrs. Vance, meanwhile, had begun to notice something, though not, at first, the truth of it. She noticed only that the Earl's visits had grown too frequent to be entirely explained by courtship of Louisa alone, and she noticed, with the particular sharpened instinct of a mother whose whole strategy depended upon a single successful match, that Eleanor's presence at these visits had become somehow indispensable, requested by name, remarked upon by the Earl himself. Rather than suspect the true cause, she arrived instead at a solution more comfortable to her own understanding of the world. That Eleanor, however plain and unremarkable, had grown into an inconvenient distraction who required a match of her own, swiftly, before she could disrupt the far more important business of securing Louisa's future. "Mr. Pemberton has asked most particularly after you," Mrs. Vance announced one morning, over a breakfast Eleanor had been eating in peace until that moment. Mr. Josiah Pemberton was a widower of considerable property and negligible conversation, some 20 years Eleanor's senior, who had buried one wife already and appeared to regard the acquisition of a second as a matter of practical household management, requiring no more sentiment than the purchase of a new carriage horse. "He admires your sensible nature, Eleanor, and your want of vanity, and has all but declared himself ready to make an offer, should you encourage him even slightly." "I have never encouraged Mr. Pemberton in my life, Mamma, beyond the barest civility." "Then you must begin, and promptly. It would settle matters very tidily, do you not see, and remove any awkwardness from the Earl's attentions, which I confess have begun to seem rather scattered of late, for reasons I cannot entirely account for." Mrs. Vance's eyes, sharp with a mother's half-formed suspicion, rested on her younger daughter a moment too long. "You would not wish, I think, to be the cause of any misfortune to your sister's prospects, Eleanor. You have never been a selfish girl. I should be very sorry to discover you had become one now." The accusation landed exactly where it was aimed, and Eleanor spent the following days turning it over with a misery she could not entirely reason her way out of, wondering whether her mother had, without quite naming it, seen the truth after all, and whether her own heart, however unwillingly given, was in fact a danger to the family that depended upon her plainness remaining unremarkable. She endured 2 calls from Mr. Pemberton with as much civility as she could muster and as little encouragement as courtesy allowed, and told herself, grimly, that perhaps this was simply the shape her life was meant to take, not the poor stranger she had loved at 17, returned improbably as an earl, but a widower's second wife, valued for her sense rather than loved for herself, which was, she reminded herself, rather more than many women were given. It was against this quiet, grinding resignation that the harvest ball arrived, held that year at Rosemere Park itself for the first time in a generation, and it was there that the tension finally broke. Eleanor had not wished to attend. She had argued, quietly and without success, that her presence was unnecessary, that Louisa required no chaperone at an event in the Earl's own home, that she would be more used to the household remaining behind to manage the accounts her father could no longer bear to look at. Her mother had overruled her entirely, insisting that appearances required the whole family present, and so Eleanor had gone, dressed once again in something chosen to draw no attention, and had spent the first hour of the evening standing near the edge of the ballroom, watching her sister dance with a series of eligible young men who were decidedly not the Earl. The Earl, in fact, was nowhere to be seen for the better part of an hour, and Eleanor had begun to relax into the relief of his absence when she felt, rather than saw, someone come to stand beside her. "You are not dancing," Lord Rosemere said quietly. "No one has asked me, my lord. That is a poor accounting of the situation, and I think you know it." His voice was low, meant only for her, though the crowd around them made privacy impossible in any true sense. "I have watched 3 gentlemen approach you this evening and lose their nerve before completing the attempt. I begin to suspect you have perfected some particular expression designed to discourage exactly this kind of overture." Despite herself, Eleanor felt the corner of her mouth twitch. "I cannot account for the courage of strangers, my lord." "Then, account for mine." He held out his hand, and something in the gesture, in the stillness of his face as he made it, told her this was not a small thing he was asking. "Dance with me, Eleanor." "Once. I find I have waited 7 years for considerably less." The room seemed to draw very close around them, though no one else appeared to notice, or if they did, they mistook it for the ordinary courtesy of a host attending to a guest. Eleanor looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment, aware of every eye that was not upon them, and every eye that soon would be, aware of her mother somewhere across the room, already beginning to preen at the sight of the Earl's attention falling, however briefly, on a Vance daughter, not yet understanding which daughter it was. She took his hand. They did not speak, for the length of the first turn, and Eleanor was grateful for it, grateful for the simple physical fact of his hand at her waist, and his eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made speech feel unnecessary, even dangerous. It was only as the second turn began that he spoke again, low enough that only she could hear it. "I found the letters," he said. Eleanor's steps faltered, just slightly, and he steadied her without comment, without breaking the rhythm of the dance, though his eyes had gone very serious. "What letters?" "Mine, the ones I sent you 7 years ago, and the one I was sent in return, informing me of your marriage. I found them 3 days past, in a locked drawer in my own steward's office of all places, left there by a housekeeper who has since confessed the whole of it to me." His jaw tightened. "It was not your doing, Eleanor. It was not mine. It was a woman who believed herself acting in the interest of a family she had served for 30 years, who intercepted every letter I sent you and forged, in careful imitation of your hand, the single letter that convinced me you had married, and moved beyond me entirely." The music continued around them, oblivious, and Eleanor felt the floor of the world tilt very slightly beneath her feet. "Who," she managed, "would have done such a thing, and why?" "Your mother did not do it," he said, before she could ask the question she feared most. I want you to understand that clearly. It was my own family's housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Prentice, who served my late mother for decades, and who believed, in her own misguided loyalty, that a match between the future Earl of Rosemere and a country gentleman's daughter of no particular fortune would ruin the prospects she had spent a lifetime protecting for the family she loved. She did not act from malice toward you, Eleanor. She acted from a devotion so fierce it curdled into cruelty, and she has confessed the whole of it to me, weeping, and begged forgiveness she has not yet received, because I find I cannot yet grant it, not fully, not while I consider what those 7 years cost us both. Eleanor's throat had gone tight. 7 years of grief, of quiet resignation, of telling herself again and again that she had simply not been worth remembering, and all of it built on a lie manufactured by a stranger's misguided love for a family that was not even her own. "I do not know what to do with this," she whispered. "I do not know how to simply set down 7 years of believing myself forgotten." "You do not have to set it down all at once," he said, and his hand at her waist tightened, just slightly, an anchor rather than a demand. "But I would ask you to believe this much, here, now, in the middle of a ballroom where I have no right to be saying any of it. I never forgot you. Not for a single day of those 7 years. I built the whole of my public life around the memory of a girl who argued with me about cowper on a broken wall above a mill pond, and when I inherited this title, I did not want, the first thing I did, before I had even finished mourning my brother, was ask my steward whether a family named Vance still lived in Hartwick." The music was ending. Eleanor was acutely aware of it, aware of the moment approaching when they would have to release each other and return to the fiction that had governed the last month of their acquaintance, and she found, with something like despair, that she did not want to. "You are still expected to marry my sister," she said, as the final notes faded, and his hand slid reluctantly from her waist. "Whatever you have told me tonight changes nothing about that expectation, my lord, and I do not know how you mean to escape it without ruining us both." "I do not intend to marry your sister," he said, quietly, but with a certainty that startled her. "I have never intended it, and I will make that plain to your mother and to the whole of this county before the week is out, whatever the cost. I have spent 7 years paying for another woman's lie. I will not spend a single day more." He bowed to her then, correct and formal as the dance required, and stepped away into the crowd before she could answer, leaving her standing alone at the edge of the ballroom, with her heart beating so hard she feared the whole room must hear it, and the terrible, wonderful certainty growing in her that everything was about to change. It changed 3 days later, at a dinner her mother had arranged with an urgency bordering on desperation, sensing perhaps that some current was moving beneath the surface of events that she did not fully understand, and wished to arrest before it could sweep her carefully constructed plans away entirely. The Earl of Rosemere arrived precisely on time, and dispensed with pleasantries almost immediately, in a manner that made Mrs. Vance's smile falter for the first time in weeks. "Mrs. Vance," he said, once the party was seated, "I owe your family an explanation, and I find I can no longer delay it in good conscience." Mrs. Vance's hand fluttered to her chest. "My lord, I am certain whatever it is can wait until after." "It cannot." His voice was gentle but entirely without give. "I have allowed an impression to stand these past weeks that I did not correct swiftly enough, and I have watched it cause pain to people I care for a great deal, and I will not permit it to continue a moment longer than it must. I have never sought an understanding with your daughter Louisa. I regard her with genuine respect and, I hope, something approaching friendship, but I have no wish to marry her, nor has she, I believe, any particular wish to marry me." Louisa, to her credit, said nothing to contradict him, though her eyes flicked toward her mother with something like relief. Mrs. Vance's face had gone the color of ash. "My lord, I do not understand. The whole county believes my husband's affairs are arranged upon the expectation. I am aware of your husband's affairs, Mrs. Vance, and I will address them directly, separate from any question of marriage, because I do not believe a family's survival should be made to depend upon a match neither party truly desires. He turned, and his eyes found Eleanor's across the table, steady and unafraid. It is your daughter Eleanor I have come to speak of. I loved her 7 years ago, before I held any title, before I had anything to offer beyond my own poor company, and I have loved her, without interruption, every year since. Through a separation I now know to have been engineered by a cruel deception, rather than any failing of feeling on either side. I am asking, before this family and whatever consequence it brings, for your permission to court her properly, as she deserves to have been courted from the first, and I am asking Eleanor herself whether she will permit me the chance to earn what I so nearly lost, through no fault of my own. The silence that followed was so complete that Eleanor could hear the clock ticking in the hall beyond the dining room. Her father, who had said almost nothing through the whole ordeal, set down his glass with a hand that trembled slightly. "My lord," he said slowly, "if you are in earnest, then I confess I would rather see my daughter loved than see this family saved, though God knows we need saving badly enough." "Edmund," Mrs. Vance's voice was faint with disbelief. "Margaret, I have watched that girl fold herself smaller every year of her life to make room for the rest of us, and I have said nothing, because I did not know what else there was to say. I will not say nothing now." He looked at the Earl with something that might have been the first flicker of genuine respect. "You will settle nothing on this family in exchange for my daughter's hand, my lord. Whatever debts we owe, we will find some other way to answer them. I will not have it said that Eleanor was bought." "I would not dream of buying her, sir," Lord Rosemere said quietly. "I mean only to ask her. The rest is between your family and whatever fortune you make of it, and I will help where I am permitted to help as a friend of the family, not as the price of a marriage." Every eye in the room turned to Eleanor then, and she found, for one long, suspended moment, that she could not speak at all. 7 years of quiet grief rose in her throat, alongside 7 weeks of confused, aching hope, and beneath both of them, older still, the small, stubborn pride that had kept her upright through every dinner where her mother's eyes slid past her, every ballroom where she stood unasked at the edge of the dancing. "I do not wish to be your rescue, my lord," she said finally, her voice unsteady but clear. "I do not wish to be married because you feel you owe me 7 years, or because your conscience will not rest until the debt is paid. If you ask for my hand, I would have it asked because you want me, plainly and entirely, not because you are trying to correct a wrong that was never truly your doing." "Then let me be plain," he said, and something in his voice had changed, gone rougher and more urgent, as though the correct formality of the evening had finally cracked open to show what lay beneath it. "I do not want you because I owe you anything, Eleanor. I want you because you are the only person who has ever argued with me about a poet and made me think harder for the argument. I want you because you noticed a stray dog limping along the mill pond path 7 years ago and would not rest until you had found it a home, though you had precisely nothing to offer it yourself. I want you because you have spent this entire evening watching your family's future be decided around you with more grace and more quiet dignity than anyone in this room has any right to expect of you, and because I have watched you do it for weeks now, and every single time I have wanted nothing in this world so much as to stand beside you rather than merely near you. I am not offering to rescue you. I am asking you to let me love you, which I have been doing, badly and at a great distance, for 7 years, and which I would very much like the chance to do properly, for the whole of however many years remain to us." Eleanor felt the tears come then, at last, after 7 years of careful containment, and she did not try to stop them. "Yes," she said, and the word came out smaller than she intended, and then, more firmly, because she found she meant it with her whole unguarded heart. "Yes, I will let you love me, Gabriel, if you will let me love you in return, without owing and without rescuing, only that." The dinner that followed was, by every account later given in the village, one of the strangest and most delightful evenings Hartwick had witnessed in a generation, and Mrs. Vance recovered her composure with a speed that impressed even her husband, pivoting within the hour from mourning the loss of an earl for Louisa to celebrating the securing of one for Eleanor, a transformation so complete that Louisa laughed about it for weeks afterward. There remained, of course, the matter of her father's debts, which Lord Rosemere addressed precisely as he had promised, not as a condition of the marriage, but as an act of separate and quiet friendship, arranging through his solicitor a fair purchase of a parcel of Rosemere land bordering Bramwell that had, in truth, always rightfully belonged in dispute between the estates, and settling the matter in a manner that left Mr. Vance's pride entirely intact, even as his fortunes recovered. There remained, too, the matter of Louisa, who confessed, once the dust of the engagement had settled, that her heart had in fact been engaged for the better part of a year with Mr. Edward Fenwick, the new curate of Hartwick Parish, a man of considerable goodness and negligible fortune, whom she had never dared mention given the family's desperate need of a grander match. Eleanor watched her sister's face soften with an entirely new kind of happiness when Gabriel, upon hearing the story, quietly arranged a modest living for Fenwick at a parish within the Rosemere estate itself, sufficient to support a household, and told Louisa plainly that he would rather see two sisters happily settled than one grandly and unhappily so. Mrs. Prentice, the housekeeper whose cruel devotion had cost them both 7 years, was pensioned and sent to live with a sister in the north, and though Gabriel never spoke of the matter with anything but a careful, controlled grief, Eleanor understood that some part of him mourned the loss of a woman who had, whatever her sins, loved his family in her own broken way, even as he could not forgive what that love had cost him. The wedding was held at the ruined chapel above the mill pond, restored for the occasion at Eleanor's particular request, its roof mended and its walls cleared of ivy, though she had asked that the broken wall, where she had once argued about Cowper with a poor stranger, be left precisely as it was, weathered and imperfect, a small monument to the 7 years it had taken them to find their way back to each other. She wore that morning a gown of pale blue rather than grey, chosen entirely by herself, and stood at the chapel door in the early autumn light, with her father's arm beneath her hand, and thought, with a clarity that felt almost like disbelief, of the girl who had walked this same path a fortnight past, believing herself entirely alone in the world, unaware that the man waiting for her at the end of it had spent 7 years and every ounce of his hard-won position simply trying to find his way back to a summer he had never once forgotten. Gabriel stood at the altar in the same stillness she remembered from the day he had turned at the sound of the chapel gate, and when she reached him, he took her hand in both of his, exactly as he had done that morning among the broken stones, and said, quietly, only for her, "I told you once that I had waited 7 years for considerably less than a dance. I find I would wait 70 more for this, if it were asked of me." "It will not be asked of you," Eleanor said, smiling despite the tears that blurred her vision, "because I do not intend to let you go again, my lord, not for 7 years, nor 7 days, nor even a single hour, if I can help it." "Then we are agreed," he said, on the one point that has ever truly mattered, and the vicar, who had waited with admirable patience through the whole of this private exchange, cleared his throat and began the service that would make official what both of them had known, in their separate and grieving hearts, for 7 long years. That some loves, however thoroughly buried, however cruelly interrupted, do not die simply because they are told to. They wait, they endure, and when at last the lie that separated them falls away, they return, whole and unashamed, to claim what was always rightfully theirs. Eleanor Vance, who had spent a lifetime learning to make herself small, walked out of that chapel on the arm of the man who had waited years to see her again, and for the first time in all her remembering, she did not feel small at all. She felt, entirely and at last, seen.